This video will be a ridiculously brief introduction to Language, Truth, and Logic by Ayer. Now, Ayer is one of the logical positivists, and this is the book to read if you want a basic introduction to logical positivism. Now, you actually can't understand what you need to understand just by reading this book, but as far as being introduced to logical positivism as such is concerned, well, you really do want this book. There are ideas, though, that logical positivism is concerned with, and one idea in particular, and that idea is completely wrong. And in order to understand that, there's more you really ought to read. Ideally, you would read some David Hume, some Immanuel Kant, some Thomas Reid, some William James, some Alvin Plantinga, and some Thomas Kuhn, and some Karl Popper, and A.J. Ayer, and some others too, Quine, Willard Van Orman Quine, Wittgenstein, Bertrand Russell, etc., etc. So, at the risk of going too far afield and not introducing this book, let's briefly introduce these ideas and say what are the priorities for where to study them. The idea in particular that motivates logical positivism is the verifiability criterion of meaning. Now let me first interrupt myself to say logical positivism is a tradition in modern/contemporary philosophy, roughly early 1900s, and it was particularly dominant in English-speaking philosophy. We're talking Britain and the USA for a couple of decades, although its founders came from continental Europe. A.J. Ayer was one of the logical positivists, and this is his book introducing the ideas of the tradition. Now, the verifiability criterion of meaning was the central claim of the logical positivist, and this book is really good for being introduced to the verifiability criterion of meaning and what are some of its consequences. But in order to really understand what's going on here, you need to have some idea of the bigger conversation that the logical positivists and their critics are a part of. And that's a conversation over something that's sometimes referred to as the problem of induction, though I don't like that name. I like to think of what I call X-beliefs until I come up with a better name for them. What we're talking about here is any belief which is necessary to learn about the world from experience, but which is not itself learned from experience. And it can't be learned from experience because it's necessary to learn about the world from experience. Let me give you a quick list of some of the X-beliefs. These are beliefs like, I am in the world, or maybe we should say I'm not in the matrix, and my five senses put me in contact with this world outside my mind. Or maybe you can break this up and say it in this way. The world outside my mind exists, and my five senses put me in contact with it. You can also add reason is reliable, whether you understand reason to be primarily a deductive logic thing or an inductive logic thing or something else. And then there's the whole, in Kant we talk about the nature of space and time as X-beliefs, but let's not give too many examples right now. There's also the whole issue of the uniformity of nature and the principle of induction. The principle of induction states we can learn about what we have not experienced from what we have. And the principle of the uniformity of nature says that, well, I won't say things always happen in the same way, but insofar as the physical world is concerned, things always happen in the same way, or the same laws of physics are always in effect when we're talking about the physical world. I'm not making any religious claim in stating, and the uniformity of nature principle does not, in stating this, make any religious claim or anti-religious claim. We're not saying the laws of nature are all there are. We're just saying the same ones are always in effect insofar as the physical world is concerned. And that helps to justify science. It can justify the principle of induction. It can tell us this is why we can learn about what we have not experienced from what we have. Or you could go the other way. You can say we can learn about what we have not experienced from what we have, and in our experience we find a whole lot of uniformity to the laws of nature. Therefore, they're probably in effect in places where we have not experienced them. One principle will justify the other. But the problem of induction, as it's sometimes called, is the problem of justifying really both of these principles. And this is what I call more generally the problem of X-beliefs, until, again, I find a better name for them. And again, this is the problem of, or at least the situation of, finding a justification for beliefs that cannot be learned from experience because they are part of how we learn about the world from experience. David Hume, in this book, sections 4 and 5 of David Hume's Inquiry Concerning Human Understanding, discovered this problem. Except it's not really a problem unless you insist that all knowledge of the world must come from experience, and that's something Hume insists. Now, Hume had the wisdom, the humility, the philosophical professionalism to recognize that this was a situation, and he ended up concluding, we have rational belief, but we don't have any knowledge, because Hume claimed, 1, all knowledge about the world outside the mind must come from experience, and 2, all knowledge from experience relies on these X-beliefs, which it does. Hume was correct about that. And so that led to the conclusion we don't have any knowledge about the world outside the mind. The logical positivists, now, they weren't so, I think they were not as clear thinking as Hume on this point, at least. They agreed entirely, though, with Hume that all knowledge of the world outside the mind must come from experience. And now let me finally get back to stating what is the verifiability criterion of meaning. It also comes from Hume. It is the statement that any meaningful statement, it's a statement about statements, it's a statement that a meaningful statement about the world outside the mind can be verified in experience, sensory experience in particular. In other words, all meaningful statements are the sort that can be tested by science. The verifiability criterion of meaning, again, states that there is no such thing as a meaningful statement about the world outside the mind except for a statement which is verifiable in experience. Now, following Hume and disagreeing to some extent with Kant, you can state this a little more formally and say statements that have meaning come in 2 categories. One is what Hume called relations of ideas, or what some people call analytic statements. And they do not tell us anything about the world outside our minds. They just describe how ideas in our mind necessarily connect with each other, like 2 + 2 = 4, and all bachelors are unmarried males, or something like that. These are analytic statements, meaning what you say about the subject of the sentence is already contained in the idea of the subject. And so these are necessary truths, and they are tautologies, but they also don't say anything about the world outside the mind. They just describe how our minds connect to these ideas, the idea of 2 and 2 and 4, the idea of bachelors and unmarried males, and so on. Okay, so where was I? I was stating the verifiability criterion of meaning and giving it this definition. The verifiability criterion of meaning can be stated more formally as the teaching that meaningful statements fall into 2 categories. One, those analytic statements, or the truths of reason, or relations of ideas, as Hume called them, statements that do not say anything about the world outside the mind, but they're also 100% true. They're just true descriptions of how our minds connect ideas. They're not descriptions of any mind-independent fact. And then secondly, statements that are verifiable in experience. So the only kind of statement that has any meaning at all about any reality outside our minds is a verifiable one. That's what the logical positivist said. And now I think I will wrap up this video in 3 stages. First stage, I will say something about why the verifiability criterion of meaning is wrong. Second stage, I'll say something about the importance of this book. Third stage, I will look at a couple of interesting passages in the book and then quit because I need to go home in a few minutes. All right then, firstly, why is the verifiability criterion of meaning wrong? It's because of X-beliefs. It's because, quite simply, the X-beliefs are not verifiable. They are how we verify things. And that means you can't verify them. You can't verify something that verification itself has to assume. And they are meaningful statements about the world outside the mind. The uniformity of nature is a statement about the world outside the mind. And it's how we verify things scientifically. So So it's meaningful, and it's not verifiable, and therefore the verifiability criterion of meaning was wrong. This is the reason, the number one reason logical positivism is wrong. There may be other reasons of some interest, but this is the big one. This is the one I really care about. And this is the one that Bertrand Russell, at the end of his essay on logical positivism, this is the one Bertrand Russell said shows that logical positivism is wrong. This was also central to Karl Popper's critique of logical positivism in his philosophy of science. Now, is that all I need to say about that? Probably. Next stage, I was going to say very briefly, what's the significance of this book? What this book is a superb introduction to the verifiability criterion of meaning and some of its consequences as they were understood by the logical positivists. And that's all for the second stage. Now, third stage, let's just look at a few passages in the book. I'm using, I think it's public domain by now, and you can probably find it on the internet. But what I'm using is the Dover edition, 1952. And I think we'll skip over the introduction, but I think there's a preface we want to look at. The preface to the first edition talks about where some of these ideas come from. He mentions Bertrand Russell, Wittgenstein, David Hume, and Berkeley. And A.J. Ayer says, like Hume, I divide all genuine propositions into two classes, those which in his terminology concern relations of ideas and those which concern matters of fact. The former class comprises the a priori, that means independently of experience, the a priori propositions of logic and pure mathematics, and these I allow to be necessary and certain only because they are analytic, which is a fancy way of saying the statements don't say anything about the subject of the sentence except what's already contained in the idea of the subject. That is, I maintain that the reason why these propositions cannot be confuted in experience is that they do not make any assertion about the empirical world, but simply record our determination to use symbols in a certain fashion. Propositions concerning empirical matters of fact, on the other hand, I hold to be hypotheses which can be probable but never certain. And that's it. That's the verifiability criterion of meaning. That one paragraph, first paragraph, preface to the first edition, tells us almost everything we even need to know about logical positivism and A.J. Ayer's book, Language, Truth, and Logic. That was the statement that all meaningful statements about the world outside the mind are verifiable in experience. Or more precisely and with a little more information, it's the statement that all meaningful statements are either verifiable statements about the world outside the mind, or they are statements that are 100% certain descriptions of how our minds connect certain concepts, but they don't make any statement about the world outside the mind. So the rest is details. Really, that one paragraph tells you everything, and the rest is details. But some of the details are kind of important. A.J. Ayer continues, to test whether a sentence expresses a genuine empirical hypothesis, I adopt what may be called a modified verification principle. You know what? I should have said the first two paragraphs because that was kind of important. I think I was jumping ahead to some of the next paragraph. Anyway, the first two paragraphs tell you everything you need to know, and the rest is details, but some of them are important details. For I require, says Ayer, of an empirical hypothesis, not indeed that it should be conclusively verifiable, but that some possible sense experience should be relevant to the determination of its truth or falsehood. Now, that's, again, filling out the verifiability criterion of meaning. And note that he doesn't say conclusive verifiability is necessary for a statement to be meaningful. There just has to be some possible sense experience that's relevant to whether a statement is true or false. So verifiability is not final and decisive, but it does mean finding sensory experiences. It means the possibility. Verifiability means the possibility of finding sensory experiences that are relevant to the truth or falsehood of a statement. In other words, let me try to state this more succinctly. A statement is verifiable if, and only if, there is such a thing as some possible sensory experience, some experience of taste, sight, smell, hearing, or touch, that is relevant to whether that statement is true or false. Now, A.J. Ayer continues, if a putative proposition fails to satisfy this principle and is not a tautology, i.e., a truth of reason, an a priori proposition, an analytic statement, a Humean relation of ideas, then, says A.J. Ayer, I hold that it is metaphysical, and that being metaphysical, it is neither true nor false, but literally senseless, i.e., meaningless. It will be found that much of what ordinarily passes for philosophy is metaphysical according to this criterion, and in particular that it cannot be significantly asserted that there is a non-empirical world of values, or that men have immortal souls, or that there is a transcendent God. So I think at this point I will wrap this up pretty quickly. There's not much else to say, really. Again, the rest is details, and the book is recommended reading for understanding the details, but those were the statements of the main ideas. Now, there's maybe two things I want to say about the details. First, I want to say that it's not verifiability in practice necessarily, it's verifiability in principle that matters. It's page 36 is where A.J. Ayer talks about that. Verifiability in principle is what matters. Well, these days this seems outdated. The proposition that there are mountains on the farther side of the moon. So let's not do that one. Let's say the proposition that there are mountains on the farther side of a moon on the opposite side of the galaxy orbiting a star with such and such characteristics. And we can't verify that with any current level of technology or anything anytime soon. But it's still possible to say what sort of sensory experience would be relevant to it. If we could build a fast enough spaceship and go there and look at the mountain, or look at the other side of this moon, or, well, find a star that fits that characteristic, see if it has a moon, or maybe I can say planet orbiting a star, find a star of that description, see if it's got a planet with a moon, look at the far side of the moon, and then we can say what sort of visual experience of looking at the far side of that moon would be relevant to the proposition that there are mountains there. All right. All verifiable propositions are probable but never 100% certain. And statements that are not verifiable but are about a world outside the mind are not actually statements. Rather, sentences that are supposedly about the world outside the mind but which are not verifiable don't have any meaning at all. They are not even false, but nonsensical. They're sheer gibberish. Literally, as Alvin Plantinga is favorable of illustrating, the gibberish words from Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll tell us exactly the same things as, according to A.J. Ayer at least, any statement about God or about ethics or about metaphysics. So state Plato's theory of forms, or Aristotelian universals, or Berkeley's metaphysics, or Descartes' metaphysics, or Spinoza, Leibniz, or name any one of the Ten Commandments, or Confucian or Aristotelian descriptions of virtues, or Kant's ethics, and they're all saying exactly the same thing. So are the denials of them. The statement God exists and atheism, the statement God does not exist, all of these statements I'm referring to, from Plato to atheism and all the things I've mentioned in between, all gibberish, all meaningless. None of them are even false because they don't even mean anything at all. They're all saying precisely the same thing as, "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gimble in the wabe, while Mimsy wore the borogoves and the mome raths out grabe," which is to say they're not saying anything at all. That's what A.J.R. says. Plantinga is insightful on this. He points out that according to this teaching, what logical positivists do is not atheism of the usual sort. They don't deny that God exists. They deny that there is any meaningful statement about God. So A.J. Ayer explicitly, maybe I'll find you a page number here, A.J. Ayer will explicitly tell us that the statement of atheism does not exist. There is no such thing as atheism. The sentence God exists is meaningless because it's not verifiable, and therefore so is the statement that God does not exist. So atheism is gibberish, just like Christianity. So Plantinga points out that the mistake the logical positivists say that religious people are making is not the belief that God exists. The mistake they're making is the belief that they believe that God exists. In other words, normal atheists like Nietzsche, or who's fashionable these days, maybe Richard Dawkins, normal atheists will deny that God exists. Logical positivists will deny that Christians exist. Or at least they'll deny that the people we call Christians believe in God. The Pope's not actually Catholic. Muslims don't exist either, or Hindus. All right, maybe I'll still find that passage, but I haven't yet. He talks a lot about theories in metaphysics, substance, and universals, and says they're all meaningless. That's in chapter 1. Talks about what is the function of philosophy and clarifying these things in chapter 2. Mostly I just want to get to an observation on, or maybe he talks about universals later. Page 58 in chapter 2. What is a universal? That's a theory of metaphysics that involves Plato and Aristotle. This question, what is universal, is not, as it has traditionally been regarded, a question about the character of certain real objects, but a request for a definition of a certain term. Because that's all we can do in philosophy. And once we find that that term cannot be defined in concepts that can be verified, we say they're not verifiable, and therefore there's no real concept there at all. At the end of chapter 1, he'll say we've been deceived by grammar. And that is why we think that all our talk about metaphysics actually means something. None of it actually does. It's all the deception of grammar. All right. Do I need to say anything else other than mentioning the chapter on ethics and theology? Chapter 6, Critique of Ethics and Theology, will specifically tell us why, according to the verifiability criterion of meaning, all theological and ethical talk is meaningless. There is no such thing as a theological claim any more than there's a metaphysical claim in philosophy. Metaphysics and philosophy, all meaningless. Theology, all meaningless. Ethics, all meaningless. And so the logical positivists famously gave us not a theory in ethics, but a theory about ethics. It's the theory that what we think of as ethical claims are not verifiable, and therefore they are not claims at all. What they are is just expressions of emotion. Now, this doctrine is what is called emotivism. And C.S. Lewis and Alasdair MacIntyre did some interesting and important work critiquing emotivism in The Abolition of Man by Lewis and After Virtue by MacIntyre. Highly recommended reading. Now, I think I can mention which page it was where he mentions that atheism is a meaningless teaching, just as is religion. And then maybe we will be finished with this video at last. Page 116 in this edition. He gives to the theist the same comfort as we gave to the moralist. His assertions cannot possibly be valid, but they cannot be valid. They cannot be invalid either, because again, religion and metaphysics and ethics are not even false. They're all meaningless, and so are the denials of religious claims and metaphysical claims and moral claims. All right. Maybe one final observation. Normally, I say what a philosopher says. I don't say much else. Sometimes I don't have a choice, though, but to state some agreement or disagreement with the philosopher. This is one of those times. The verifiability criterion of meaning is wrong, catastrophically wrong. It is the greatest mistake ever made in the history of philosophy, I'm convinced. And you need to know this book. Not to learn directly the truth about something that's right. Here you want to know this book to know some errors and the source of them. This idea of the logical positivist is, as people like Lewis and MacIntyre explain, the source of many errors. Finally, I really should say one thing, though. One thing more complimentary about this book. The idea that what science does essentially is verify is an interesting and important idea in philosophy of science. And it's an idea where I think the logical positivists are perfectly respectable, very sensible, and partly correct. Now, Karl Popper says, no, science doesn't verify at all, it only falsifies. And the logical positivists say what science does is it verifies. And Thomas Kuhn gives his own subtle account that includes some elements of both. I don't think we can say science falsifies and doesn't verify at all. I think there's something wrong with Karl Popper's theory. But I think there's also something wrong with this theory that science verifies and doesn't falsify. Popper's onto something. Science does involve falsifiability and falsification. But I do want to state that I have great respect for the definition of science as essentially an exercise in verification of claims that are essentially verifiable. I think that's a very respectable philosophy of science. And I think the positivists did a good job there. They just weren't completely right. Popper was also at least partially right. And I think the correct answer will include a good chunk of both. All right. I'm done. Language, Truth, and Logic by A.J. Ayer. The book itself is better than my video on the subject. And thanks for watching.